Jerusalem is, of course, an ancient city. We read of David wresting control of the site from the Jebusites and making it the seat of his kingdom. We read of Solomon constructing the first temple. But during the United Monarchy, Jerusalem was a tiny, underdeveloped city, a fraction of what we have come to expect when we hear Jerusalem. It did not take off as a city in earnest until the reign of Hezekiah, but of course was essentially sent back to square one by the armies of Babylon's Nebuchadnezzar. It would achieve its former dimensions again only in the Hasmonean period, and it was Herod that brought it to its peak as a city. Herod the Great came to the throne of Judea, Samaria, Idumea, Galilee, and a number of other regions as a result of a long and effective history of cooperating with Rome's representatives in the East and demonstrating his ability to align his own interests with those of Rome. This made him the front-running candidate to replace Hyrcanus II, the last Rome-approved ruler of the Hasmonean dynasty, after Hyrcanus was overthrown by the last surviving son of his brother and rival, Aristobulus. As a client king, Herod was not permitted to engage in foreign policy apart from Rome's approval. This meant that, unlike the Hasmonean dynasty that he replaced, he was not in a position to yield to the temptation to expand his territory through costly military action. With Rome's strong support, on the other hand, he was never forced to invest his energies and resources in struggles against rival claimants to the throne. He was therefore both free and forced to focus his attention and his ambition on developing the territory that had been allotted to him, and this he did magnificently. On the typical 10-day to 2-week tour of Israel, visitors would encounter signs of Herod's building activities everywhere. Caesarea by the sea, Sebaste in Samaria, the renovated fortifications and entirely new palaces at Masada, the fortress palace of Herodion, and the palaces outside of Jericho. Herod changed the landscape of Israel more than any other single ruler. Herod's most celebrated building program, of course, was his renovation and expansion of the Jerusalem temple. When Jesus' disciples came to Herod's temple, they responded to the sight like ordinary tourists, exclaiming, "Teacher, look, what massive stones and huge buildings." Herod had hoped for and designed the new and improved Temple Mount precisely to evoke just such a response. One can still read Josephus's eyewitness account of Herod's work in the Antiquities, Book 15, or the War, Book 5. In regard to upgrading the sanctuary itself, Herod worked within the constraints set for him by the priests. He had members of their lineage trained in masonry and related skills so that no laypersons would enter the holy places for the sake of the construction work. All the materials required for the renovation of the sanctuary itself, which included a dramatic new facade and extensive ornamentation, were first gathered before any work began, and the work itself was completed within 2 years, between 20 and 18 BC, with no interruption of the schedule of sacrifices. The main features of the project were completed by 10 BC, though work would continue in some fashion, largely on account of subsidences and repairs, until about 62 AD, just a few short years prior to the destruction of the entire complex in the year 70. Almost no remnants of the temple itself have survived, though there are occasional representations of it from near contemporary sources, such as this silver tetradrachm from the Second Jewish Revolt. Its accuracy is open for debate, but it is interesting to find an image of the temple that resembles so closely the facades of Roman temples from the same period, including the 4-pillared temples of Augustus that Herod erected in Caesarea by the sea, Samaria, and near Caesarea Philippi. One of the few archaeological remains of Herod's temple complex is this inscription from the perimeter fence separating the large outer court open to people of all nations, the so-called court of the Gentiles, from the inner courts that were forbidden to non-Jews. It is one of perhaps a dozen or more placed at various intervals around the balustrade. The inscription reads, "No person of another race may enter within the barrier around the temple and its surrounding enclosure. Whoever is caught doing so will have himself to blame for his ensuing death." The rumor that Paul had taken a Gentile Christian named Trophimus across this line is what incited a Jerusalem mob to attack Paul, resulting in his being arrested and taken into protective custody, as we read in the 21st chapter of Acts. Roman influence upon Herod's temple is seen also in his emphasis on a grand, artificially expanded temple platform and his construction of colonnades on every side of the temple courtyard. The sacred precincts around the sanctuary were expanded to the north, west, and south, till the space was almost doubled, reaching an area of 36 acres, or the equivalent of about 26 football fields. This was not merely an act of vanity on Herod's part, though the fact that the expansion made this the largest temple complex in the Roman world during Herod's lifetime suggests that vanity was one motive. It was also highly practical. The population of Jerusalem swelled during the great pilgrimage festivals, which could draw tens of thousands of worshippers to the city above and beyond the city's 100,000 or more residents. Herod's expansions made it possible for the temple's outer courts, at least, to accommodate far more worshippers during these peak seasons. A clear seam on the eastern retaining wall shows where Herod's southern expansion began. The stones on the right side, the north side, are cut in a common style of the Hellenistic and Hasmonean periods, a clean margin of about 2 inches in width around a rough center. The stones to the left, the south side, are cut in Herodian fashion, with a clean margin around an entirely smoothed center. Visitors to the city can easily identify stones and thus, in many cases, buildings from each of these 2 major periods, though one must always bear in mind that the stones might be in secondary use. The Emperor Hadrian, the Christian emperors, the Crusaders, even the Ottomans were avid recyclers of dressed stones of both types. Retaining walls with massive ashlar blocks and carefully engineered vaulted structures supported the expanded courtyard and the new columned porticos lining its perimeters. The architects did not merely fill the expanded platform with rocks and soil, which would have put tremendous outward stress on the retaining walls. Rather, they engineered enormous barrel-vaulted supports for the temple platform above, creating vast areas for storage and other uses under the temple platform in the process. These areas under the south extension were once called Solomon's Stables, but they are rather the result of Herod's engineers, though they were admittedly used as stables during the Crusader period. The southwest corner of the retaining wall also shows careful reinforcement through the use of massive ashlars, the customary 3 feet in height, but 40 feet long and 8 feet thick. These were set perpendicular to and overlapping one another, giving tremendous strength to this corner. The southern wall of the new complex, some 100 feet further south than the original southern end of the platform, was entirely Herodian. It would run over 900 feet in length. The bottommost course is original. The stones here are atypically large. A good portion of the steps is also original. These alternate between narrow and deep steps so as to regulate the pace of the many thousands of pilgrims that would throng up this stairway during festivals. Visitors can see the walled-up remains of the double gates that gave one point of access to the temple complex from the south side. The original lintel of the right gate, as well as parts of the arch above the lintel, are still visible. The interior of this gate, now off limits, is extremely well preserved. The two gates opened into a foyer with high domes decorated with floral and geometric designs, leading onto a tunnel and eventually staircases that ascended through the substructure and opened dramatically into the middle of the court of the Gentiles. In all, 4 gates gave entry to the temple platform from the west, 2 entrances from the south, 1 from the north, and perhaps as many as 3 from the east. On top of the new platform, running almost the full length of its southern side, Herod had a grand stoa, or columned portico, constructed. According to Josephus, this structure consisted of 4 long, parallel rows of columns, the middle 2 rows supporting a roof that was perhaps twice the height of the roof supported by the beams that connected the outermost rows to the central 2 rows. The vast covered spaces created thereby would have served a wide variety of purposes for different groups congregating there. Against the western wall, at the southwest corner, once stood a monumental stairway that rested upon these supports and upon an arch that extended over the street running alongside the western wall of the temple platform. The stairway gave access from a main north-south thoroughfare to the royal stoa and thence to the temple complex itself. The arch is named Robinson's Arch in honor of Edward Robinson, the American archaeologist who identified its remains in the early 19th century. A number of small stone cells were found built into the pier of Robinson's Arch. Artifacts related to commerce found in these areas identify these as shops, part of one of the markets located in the temple, located around the temple complex, known as the upper and lower markets. These shops were located alongside the main north-south road that connected the Damascus Gate in the north wall of the city to the Pool of Siloam, south of the Dung Gate in the current Ottoman south wall. A water channel was built into the retaining wall for a significant stretch along the south and west walls, the last leg of an aqueduct supplying the temple's reservoirs. Herod extended the temple platform to the west as well, and thus the entire 1,500-foot length of the western retaining wall dates from his time. The most celebrated stretch of Herod's retaining wall is, of course, the so-called Wailing Wall, or Western Wall. The bottom 11 courses of stones, or ashlars, are Herodian, and still stand as they were before the time of the Roman destruction of the temple's fortifications. It is likely that the surface of the platform was originally not much higher than this, as the Romans could have cleared the platform and its walls only to the level of the platform floor, but not much beyond that. The present surface of the platform is about level with the 11th course of stones. Charles Warren, an avid explorer of the Temple Mount in the 1860s, discovered by tunneling down that an additional 19 courses of these ashlars are to be found below the level of the present-day prayer plaza, grounding the retaining wall in the bedrock 70 feet below the surface. The street level in the time of Herod was considerably lower than it is now, at least another 8 to 10 courses of ashlars, or about 25 feet below the present surface. As the Herodian wall also rose considerably higher than the temple platform, it towered almost 100 feet above street level on this side. Excavations below the present surface along the exterior of the western wall have uncovered a number of further details about Herod's project, including the master course of stones. The largest stone in this course is 42 feet long by 11 feet high by 14 feet deep, the depth being estimated based on ground-penetrating radar. It weighs about 600 tons. 3 other stones of decreasing lengths bring the overall length to 100 feet. The size and the weight of these stones compensated for a large open hall on the inner side of this retaining wall, perhaps intended to serve as a massive storeroom for the temple. The use of the massive stones avoided the need for flying buttresses, such as are familiar from medieval cathedrals, to support the wall. Further north along the western wall, a portion of the Herodian street was uncovered. The pillars on the left may have opened onto an intersecting street, or perhaps onto one of several marketplaces or agoras, believed to have been located around the Temple Mount, according to descriptions of Jerusalem found in Josephus' writings. Only Herod's retaining wall has survived, but not the walls that once stood atop the platform enclosing the temple and its courts above. There are clear indications that it was designed with pilasters at regular intervals. Pilasters are decorative quasi-pillars built into and protruding slightly from the wall itself. Herod had used this decorative technique when building the tomb of the patriarchs in Hebron to the south of Jerusalem. This monument, in fact, provides a good approximation of Herod's temple enclosure in miniature. While the renovation and expansion of the temple complex was the most dramatic change to the face of Jerusalem, Herod reshaped its contours in other ways as well. He renovated an older Hasmonean fortress and joined it to the northwest corner of the expanded temple platform, renaming it Antonia in honor of his then patron, Mark Antony. He built a sprawling palace complex for himself on the west side of Jerusalem and fortified the wall north of his palace with 3 proud towers. The base of one of these towers is still standing, incorporated into a Crusader-era fortress. The palace itself consisted of 2 symmetrical wings that he named the Caesareum and Agrippaeum in honor of Augustus and Augustus' right-hand man, Marcus Agrippa. Its foundations have begun to be explored in the grounds beneath a modern police station. The remains of a Herodian period city gate have also been found to the west of the palace area. Although archaeologists have not yet located them, Herod also built a theater and hippodrome in or in the vicinity of Jerusalem, bringing Greek and Roman kinds of entertainment to his capital city. He also devoted significant resources to improving its infrastructure, particularly in regard to roads, aqueducts, and reservoirs like artificial lakes for size. Herod dramatically improved the water supply for the growing city. He added at least 1 and possibly 2 of the 3 reservoirs popularly known as Solomon's Pools, located about 8 miles south of Jerusalem and 3 miles southwest of Bethlehem. The earliest of these pools dates to the middle of the Hellenistic period and is probably to be credited to the Hasmonean rulers. Herod increased the number of aqueducts feeding these pools and then feeding Jerusalem from these pools. Herod also built a number of reservoirs around Jerusalem itself. Not half a mile from the citadel stands a massive reservoir, now known as the Mamilla Pool. With a capacity of almost 8 million gallons, it assured the water supply of the residential areas growing to the west of the Temple Mount. Routine needs for water were dramatically increased by the requirements for ritual purity for any and all people entering the temple precincts. Many ritual pools for purification by immersion, called mikvayot, or mikvah in the singular, can be found carved into the bedrock around the Temple Mount or built from stone and plaster. Some are suitable only for use by an individual. Others, like this large mikvah discovered in the area immediately south of the temple's retaining wall, could accommodate multiple people at one time. There were also large public pools throughout the city. One such pool was the Pool of Bethesda, a location that figures prominently in the story of Jesus' healing of an invalid on the Sabbath in the 5th chapter of John's Gospel. It can be difficult for visitors to imagine the ancient pool here, as it has been extensively overbuilt first by a Roman temple of Asclepius, then a Byzantine church, the foundations for which are prominent in this picture. One must remove all of this mentally to begin to picture the large open space surrounded by steps that was the ancient pool. Much of the South Pool and almost all of the North Pool remain unexcavated due to private ownership of the many homes and other buildings built over the ancient layers of remains beneath. The dimensions of the South Pool were approximately 200 by 160 feet, with the pool being slightly trapezoidal rather than a true rectangle. The Northern Pool was slightly smaller in both dimensions. While it is possible that this pool was used for drawing water for everyday use, it is more likely that it served as a public mikveh. There would have been a great need for large mikvayot such as this pool, particularly during the great pilgrimage feasts of Passover, Pentecost, and booths, with their tens of thousands of worshippers thronging to Jerusalem to participate, which would have included worship in the temple and thus the need for ritual purification of their bodies prior to entering the holy courts of the Holy Lord. It is likely that the configuration of the steps seen here were constant around the full perimeter of the second or south pool. It is possible then that the North Pool functioned as a reservoir for the South Pool and was not touched directly by people, allowing ritually clean water to flow from the North Pool into the South Pool, which would ritually cleanse the water in the South Pool perpetually. Judea and Galilee participated together in a futile revolt against Roman rule that was a response in part to Roman mismanagement of local hostilities, in part to social tensions endemic between the rich few and the many who lived at the border of poverty, in part to the conviction that God had given them this land and would fight on their side. God did not. Between 66 and 70 AD, Roman forces under the command first of Vespasian, and then, after Vespasian became emperor under his son Titus, regained control first of Galilee, then all the area of Judea around Jerusalem, and finally besieged Jerusalem itself, a siege that ended in the wholesale destruction of the temple, the city's fortifications, and much of the city itself. The death toll was staggering, the fate of many of the survivors tragic, whether they were sold as slaves, reserved for celebratory gladiatorial games throughout the region, or slaughtered outright because they were deemed too old or infirm to be of value. The 10th Legion Fretensis, instrumental in suppressing the revolt, was now permanently stationed in Jerusalem. The southwest quarter of the ruined city became a primary camp, as evidenced by plentiful finds of bricks and tiles bearing the legionary stamp and made in a large kiln works discovered west of the city, as well as an early Roman-era bathhouse. The Emperor Vespasian and his son Titus celebrated a joint triumph in Rome, in which some of the most distinctive furnishings of the Jerusalem temple, the menorah, the table of the showbread, and the trumpets, were paraded as a sign of the Roman god's victory over Israel's god. Coins minted throughout the reigns of both Vespasian and Titus commemorated the capture of Judea, symbolized on many a reverse as a woman in mourning beneath the date palm that was also particularly associated with Judea. The Jewish people became an object lesson to all, that no nation could opt out of the Roman Empire. Judea, Samaria, and Galilee now became an independent province with a governor of senatorial rank and a legion under his command. Another important and highly symbolic consequence involved the so-called temple tax of 2 denarii, formerly sent to Jerusalem for the maintenance of the now defunct temple and its sacrifices. Vespasian ordered that this tax should continue to be collected, but that the funds would now be used to subsidize the restoration and renewed cultic operations of the temple of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, the Capitoline gods who sat atop the Capitoline Hill overlooking the Roman Forum. This temple, central to the Roman state cult, had been destroyed in the Roman Civil War of 68 to 69 AD. This new tax became essentially the price for the individual Jew's freedom to practice his or her ancestral faith. One cannot escape the sense, however, that for many Jews, the requirement to give to Caesar what had been due God caused significant vexation. 40 years before, when Jesus' disciples marveled at the grandeur of the temple complex, he told them that the day would come when not one stone would be left standing upon another. This prediction proved true as the Roman army methodically tore down the fortifications surrounding the temple complex so that it could never be used as a stronghold for rebellion again. The damage to the Herodian street running alongside the western wall of the temple complex was caused here as soldiers, or more likely Jewish prisoners of war, threw down each successive course of the massive ashlars from the wall around the court above. Archaeologists have left 100 or so such stones piled up as they found them, a testimony to the Romans' thoroughness. Signs of the conflagration of Jerusalem appear in the limestone ashlars in the southern retaining wall of the temple complex. Limestone and marble are susceptible to fire, which can reduce them to powder, producing the lime that is a necessary ingredient in ancient mortar and Roman cement. As the wooden beams that supported the roofs of the structures built against the southern wall burned, the heat caused parts of the temple platform wall to burn away, as the stone there was reduced to powder. In 1970, archaeologists discovered a dwelling that had been destroyed by fire, its charred roof timbers being found at the same level of collapsed walls in a layer of soot. Coins from years 2, 3, and 4 of the first Jewish revolt were found in the debris layer, locating the house's destruction precisely to the year 70 AD, another casualty of the Roman conflagration. Among the finds in the house was the skeletal forearm of a young woman, a reminder of the slaughter that accompanied the torching of these neighborhoods as the Roman armies poured into the city. The so-called burnt house was located in an elite neighborhood, evidenced by the discovery of a network of several houses that could be classified as town mansions by ancient standards, some dating from the Hasmonean, others from the Herodian period. Given the number of mikvayot in these mansions, it is likely that these houses were owned primarily by priestly families, whose members would require regular and frequent purification for the performance of their regular duties in the temple. Evidence from the Roman conflagration of Jerusalem was found among these mansions as well, for example, in the charring of these opulently frescoed walls. The Emperor Hadrian made a tour of the eastern provinces of his empire in 129 and 130 AD, and found Jerusalem still essentially in ruins from the first Jewish revolt. Hadrian decided that he would restore the dilapidated and probably somewhat derelict Jerusalem as a new Roman colony, the Colonia Aelia Capitolina. This was in keeping with similar decisions he made to stimulate the development of the eastern provinces. While he might have thought of this as an act of general beneficence for all the people of the region, it was certainly an act of benevolence toward the legion stationed there, and the veterans and their dependents settled there, or in the near vicinity. Such a large military and ex-military population deserved to live in a genuine colonia, or colony of Rome, with all of its civic rights and amenities, and not amidst the haphazard makeovers of a former war zone. The name Aelia comes from Hadrian's family name, Aelius. The name Capitolina connected the new colony with the Capitoline Hill at the heart of Rome and the temple that sat atop the hill, the temple to the Capitoline trio of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, the Latin equivalents of Zeus, Hera, and Athena. Like Rome, Aelia would also have a Capitolium, a temple to honor these three principal deities. Well, the decision to give Jerusalem an extreme makeover as a Roman city, complete with temples for the Roman gods, was not received as anything like a generous gift by the Jewish population of Judea. The province erupted in revolt for a second time. Hostilities broke out by 132. The revolutionary forces coalesced in the southern part of Judea under the firm-handed leadership of one Simeon bar Kosiba. He was clearly a capable and charismatic leader, so much so that he acquired a messianic moniker, Simeon bar Kokhba, son of a star. Coins and documents refer to Simeon as Nasi, or prince, and letters discovered in a cave by the Dead Sea showed that he exercised an autocratic rule over the revolutionaries and anyone else caught up in their domain. The revolutionaries achieved surprising initial successes through strategically organized guerrilla warfare. Their aims centered on Jerusalem and its liberation from Roman domination, and especially on the ruined temple, whose future restoration was jeopardized by Hadrian's plan for the city. Coins featured the facade of the temple and their legends for the freedom of Jerusalem, or simply Jerusalem, represented rallying cries of the movement as a whole. Hadrian sent 3 additional legions to Judea to reinforce the 2 resident legions, and finally ended the revolt in a lengthy siege at Beitar, a fortified city about 5 miles southwest of Jerusalem, in 135 or 136 AD. The human cost of the second revolt was enormous on both sides. The cost to the Jewish people was also high in other ways, particularly in terms of the symbolic punishments inflicted on them at this time. First, Jews would be forbidden henceforth to enter the city limits of Aelia Capitolina. The ban was lifted, it would appear, for 1 day out of the year, the 9th of Av, an occasion on which the Jews were allowed to visit the city and to mourn its fate. Second, the province acquired the new name of Syria Palestina, and it is difficult to discover a rationale for this change of name other than a desire on Hadrian's part to distance the land from the Jewish ethnos, its revolutionary heritage, and the ideology of the land that sustained revolutionary impulses. The reshaping of Jerusalem as Aelia Capitolina was also energetically resumed, resulting in a thorough reconfiguration of the northern half of Jerusalem. Not surprisingly, Herodian ashlars, available in abundance amidst the ruins of the Jerusalem temple and other structures, provided the building blocks for a good portion of Hadrian's new city. Traces of Hadrian's Aelia Capitolina can be seen throughout the northern half of Jerusalem. The southwest quarter of Jerusalem, including most of what had been the upper city, remained the camp of the 10th Legion Fretensis through 300 AD. A major east-west street, the Decumanus, ran along the north side of the camp from the Jaffa Gate to the retaining wall of the Temple Mount. The new city of Aelia took shape above this line. The principal north-south street, called a cardo, sporting covered colonnades on both sides, appears to have begun its northward run at the Decumanus, terminating at what is now known as the Damascus Gate. It is clearly featured on the 6th century mosaic map of the Holy Land found at Madaba in Jordan, as is the secondary cardo that ran alongside the western wall of the Temple Mount and terminated at the Pool of Siloam, which remained in use throughout the period. Modern streets still follow these ancient lines. As it can be seen today, the Damascus Gate is an Ottoman period construction. In Hadrian's Aelia Capitolina, a 3-arched triumphal gate stood on this spot, though about 20 feet lower. The eastern pedestrian gate of Hadrian's earlier structure has been discovered beneath the present Damascus Gate, which remains the major access point on the north side of Jerusalem as it was for Aelia Capitolina. Archaeologists believe this also to have been a freestanding triumphal arch, similar to, but probably smaller than, one that can be seen today at Jerash, the ancient Decapolis city of Gerasa, as Hadrian did not rebuild walls around Jerusalem. The resident 10th Legion, after all, was its wall. The gate opened onto an oval forum with a pillar in the middle, atop which stood a statue of Hadrian as the city's founder. This can still be seen in the Madaba map from the 6th century. Once again, we can look to Gerasa or Jerash to better imagine what this oval forum looked like in Hadrian's day. A little more than halfway between the North Gate and the legionary camp to the south, Hadrian built an extensive civic forum. This space required significant engineering. An old quarry and a number of tombs had to be filled in and buried to create a level surface of adequate size for the project. The forum was home to a grand basilica and one or more temples. It is likely that the Capitolium, the temple dedicated to Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, was located here at the administrative heart of the city. Some favor the opinion that it was set rather atop the Temple Mount itself, but the evidence for this is considerably weaker, though the dramatic statement it would have made concerning the triumph of Rome's gods over Judea's own has some appeal to historians. It is likely, however, that a shrine to the imperial cult was provocatively built on the Temple Mount, as later pilgrims write of seeing statues of Hadrian there. The base of what was once a statue of Hadrian's successor, Antoninus Pius, found its way into an Islamic period rebuild of the Temple Mount's southern wall. A temple to a female goddess, most likely Tyche or Fortuna, given her appearance on coins from the period, was also erected in this civic forum. Very little remains of Hadrian's buildings here, for reasons I will return to shortly. The podium of a large structure, likely Hadrian's basilica, was found in the basement of the Russian church of St. Alexander Nevsky, part of one of the smaller pedestrian gates of another freestanding triple-arched gate has been re-erected in this church as well. The flagstones of Hadrian's West Forum, however, can be seen everywhere in recycled use, especially around the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. A street branching off to the east from the secondary Cardo led to another broad forum above the northwest corner of the Temple Mount, likely functioning as the main commercial forum for Aelia Capitolina. The west entrance to this forum is marked today by the so-called Ecce Homo arch, which is pointed out to every visitor to Jerusalem as the place where Pontius Pilate presented Jesus to the mob that the chief priests had assembled for the occasion. In reality, this arch is the central one in another triple-arched gate erected by Hadrian. The left pedestrian entryway is now enshrined behind the altar in the chapel of the Sisters of St. Anne. This gate would have resembled the well-preserved and reconstructed triumphal arch of Hadrian erected in the diaspora city of Gerasa, down to the niches beside the pedestrian gates, most likely once housing the statues of protective deities. The area once again had to be engineered to accommodate Hadrian's vision for the new city. A reservoir called the Struthian Pool, measuring 150 by 50 feet, once sat open to the sky throughout the 1st century. Barrel vaulted roofs were constructed above it, supported by archwork that bisected the pools. This would support the flagstones of the forum's pavement above. While the Herodian fortress known as the Antonia once sat between the pool and the Temple Mount, the great flagstones that are presented to modern visitors as the lithostratos, or the pavement of John's account of the trial of Jesus, as we read in John 19:13, are actually part of the pavement of Hadrian's northeastern forum and sit considerably higher than the 1st century landscape of Jerusalem. To the east of this forum, a shrine to Asclepius, the god of healing, was erected over the pools of Bethesda. These pools had been the setting for one of Jesus' miraculous healings in John's Gospel. The earliest manuscripts lack the note in John chapter 5 that recounts a particular legend concerning the pool's healing properties, but this verse begins to show up in manuscripts from the 5th century and later. Quote, "For an angel of the Lord went down at certain seasons into the pool and stirred up the water. Whoever stepped in first after the stirring of the water was made well from whatever disease that person had." The choice of these pools for a healing sanctuary dedicated to Asclepius suggests that the legend of the healing powers of its waters persevered into the 2nd and 3rd centuries. The relative altitude of the Asclepius shrine compared to the earlier pool of Bethesda again reminds us, along with the Struthian pool, of the depth at which much of Herodian Jerusalem, the Jerusalem of Jesus, lies buried after centuries of continued occupation and building. Perhaps the most spiritually meaningful experience for pilgrims to Jerusalem is walking the path of the Via Dolorosa, the path alleged to have been taken by Jesus, starting with his condemnation by Pilate and ending with his burial in the borrowed grave near Golgotha. It is important to bear in mind that the path of the Via Dolorosa, as it is now known, is an invention of the Franciscan monks who served as custodians of the Holy Land beginning in the 14th century, not a tradition that goes back, say, to Constantine in the 4th century. Today, the last 5 of the 14 stations of the cross are to be found inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the alleged site of Jesus' crucifixion and burial, and there is good reason to believe that the location is authentic. First, the central rotunda does in fact stand over a 1st century cemetery. Although most of what was once a large tomb complex had been cut away to create the rotunda, one can still see a few of the original 1st century burial niches in the Syrian Orthodox chapel behind the celebrated shrine. While it is quite uncertain that Jesus' body was laid on precisely the slab preserved beneath the great shrine in the rotunda, it is certain that such slabs and niches were available here for his temporary burial in the early 1st century. The presence of these graves indicates as well that this area was outside the city's walls during the 1st century. It is evident that the area was first used as a quarry. The modern visitor can see signs of this throughout the church, especially in the lower chapels. When the quarry ceased to operate, its exposed rock walls became ideal locations for the hewing out of new rock-cut tombs. There is also the evidence of the ongoing memory of Jerusalem Christians and early Christian pilgrims who would have been directed to this site by native sisters and brothers. An important graffito from the late 2nd century, seen now in one of the many chapels in the Holy Sepulchre complex, seems to commemorate such a pilgrimage. It bears the image of a ship and the inscription, Domine ivimus, Lord, we came. This is particularly interesting because it would show ongoing Christian interest in this site throughout the period that Golgotha and the tombs lie buried beneath Hadrian's Western Forum and its temples and basilica. When Macarius, the Bishop of Jerusalem, received permission from Constantine to destroy Hadrian's temple complex and restore access to the site of Jesus' crucifixion and burial, he seemed to know precisely where to recover the site, which again is evidence of continuity of memory. As for the rest of the Via Dolorosa, as it is currently known, it stands very little chance of being the actual route that Jesus took on that epoch-making day. The principal question is where Jesus' trial before Pilate would have taken place. The popular assumption is that this would have gone down in the Antonia fortress, the starting point for the modern Via Dolorosa. There is a much greater likelihood, however, that the trial of Jesus took place on the western side of the city, outside and within Herod's palace there. After the Romans assumed direct control over Judea in 6 AD, Herod's palace had become the praetorium, or the headquarters of the prefects and procurators of Judea whenever they left their chief headquarters in Caesarea by the sea, notably there in another of Herod's palaces, to monitor the situation in Jerusalem more closely. Faced with the choice of staying in a barracks or a sprawling villa, my money is on the prefects choosing the sprawling villa every time. A more historically accurate Via Dolorosa, therefore, would probably begin just south of the citadel, outside the grounds of Herod's palace, proceed north to the city wall, turn east for a stretch until reaching the Genath Gate just across from the old Hasmonean palace, where Herod Antipas would likely have resided during his visits to Jerusalem. The procession would then leave the city by the Genath Gate and proceed north to the rocky outcropping at the edge of the quarry called Golgotha.